Good evening. British planes helped secure the skies above Libya in the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi, but were British forces deployed on the ground as well? The air war we know about, but tonight we piece together the clandestine missions of some of this country's most secret soldiers.
Our investigations reveal that Britain did have boots on the ground in Libya, with details of who they were and what role they were meant to play.
The Conservative MP Rory Stewart and the writer Nabila Ramdani are here to discuss. And this man tells us how British Secret Service agents came to call on him while he was being held in one of Colonel Gaddafi's prisons.
Why, please explain to our taxpayers, should we pay a single penny to clear up the mess left by Silvio Berlusconi?
Our economics editor asked the Italian Prime Minister the question on the nation's lips. And does the well-being of a bunch of birds justify binning the Mayor of London's pet project of a new airport?
This is where Boris wants to put his island. But is this really about building a new hub airport for the southeast of England, or building up the Mayor's chances of being re-elected?
The British involvement in the campaign to overthrow Colonel Gaddafi was a very public one, or rather part of it. The use of RAF aircraft was very public. The fighting on the ground was said to have been done by Libyans. But Newsnight has learned that British soldiers were on the ground in Libya alongside the anti-Gaddafi forces. Our defence editor Mark Urban reports.
Britain's secret war in Libya evolved in fits and starts, but its architects believe it helped finally to tip the balance in favour of the Libyan revolutionaries, enabling them to seize the country and catch Colonel Gaddafi.
Colonel Gaddafi said he would hunt you down like rats, but you showed the courage of lions, and we salute your courage.
That success, we have learned, did involve deploying the SAS on the ground to help. But the tale of how they got there wasn't simple. The Libyan revolution started in February last year. Very quickly, the Libyan armed forces split, and the leading rebels set themselves up in Benghazi. The British government soon decided to send a rescue mission to the desert of southern Libya. It involved RAF Hercules aircraft and a couple of dozen Marines from C Squadron of the Special Boat Service. Ministry of Defence footage showed the mission, but not the commandos who were there to secure it. On the 27th of February, they mounted 3 flights to take 150 grateful foreign oil workers, 20 of them British, from Zilla in southern Libya to Valletta in Malta.
When we got onto the plane, there was 2 locals attacked the plane with large knives or machetes to try and rip the tyres. And the special forces challenged them, told them to stop. And fortunately, somebody tackled them, brought these guys down and took them back.
In the footage of the taxiing Hercules in Malta, a clue appeared to the next phase of the operation. A Special Forces Chinook helicopter awaiting its mission. For in the chaos engulfing Libya, the government decided to back the National Transitional Council, or NTC, and work for the overthrow of Gaddafi.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear this is an illegitimate regime that has lost the consent of its people, and our message to Colonel Gaddafi is simple: go now.
The next phase of the operation involved a highly sensitive unit of British Special Forces, made up jointly of the SAS and SBS. It's called E Squadron and operates closely with MI6. Early in March, 6 members of E Squadron boarded a Chinook helicopter with 2 MI6 officers and flew to a place near Benghazi. They were going to meet rebel leaders. Why do it that way when there was a British frigate sitting in a harbour nearby? Apparently MI6 wanted to avoid going near any symbol of British power. But the mission turned into a fiasco reported worldwide.
A British diplomatic team detained by rebels in Libya has been released.
Revolutionary forces.
Despite carrying everything needed for a covert mission, from civilian clothes to a variety of passports, the British had been nabbed by armed local farmers. E Squadron had come unstuck almost immediately, and the British ambassador was left to plead with the NTC to release them.
I hope to ask Mr. Jalil if he might be able to intervene to help us clear up this misunderstanding, if there's anything we can do to help explain who they are and what they were doing.
After this public embarrassment, British Special Forces were closed out of the picture for months, we've been told. But the visible commitment of planes and ships was growing. A couple of weeks later, France, the US and Britain started bombing Gaddafi's forces, and the stakes were raised again for the Cameron government. It was time to send a properly accredited team to Benghazi to liaise with the NTC. By April, half a dozen army officers in plain clothes and intelligence people were actively working in Benghazi to build capacity, an embryo defence ministry and a command structure. They operated in Benghazi, Misrata and near Brega, but they were unarmed, and their main role was to get some Libyan units working to some sort of plan while saving them from being hit by accident by NATO. That happened a couple of times, and we filmed these NTC units marking their vehicles with identification symbols as a response. The poor record of these men, though, led British liaison officers in Benghazi to argue for people able to raise their performance. The UN resolution that authorised NATO bombing specifically prohibited ground troops anywhere in Libya. But what about advisors or special forces? We've learned that the National Security Council, shortly after the bombing started, tasked military chiefs to look at the feasibility of a train and equip mission to the Libyan rebels. Publicly, meanwhile, ministers shied away from talk of boots on the ground.
This is not British ground combat forces going in, and that's what the people mean by boots on the ground. We're very clear about the United Nations resolutions. They forbid any occupation, foreign occupation of any part of Libya, and we will absolutely stick to that.
The road to sending British special forces back into Libya lay via Qatar. The Emirate had taken a strong stance against Gaddafi from the outset. Visits from British and French military chiefs led to a joint mission being established. Special forces from all three countries would be sent to Libya to assist with training, as well as coordinating their command and NATO airstrikes. The French would go to the west, the British to the east, and by August, around 20 men from D Squadron of 22 SAS were operating in small teams at places like Brega and Misrata, as well as a training base in southern Libya. The airstrikes had gone on for months, and many had predicted that doing it from the skies alone might not work.
It's become a much more difficult fight, much more difficult targets. As I've observed in recent days, essentially it is very much stalemate-like in the vicinity of Ajabi and Brega.
Within days of the new teams moving into action, the NTC was fighting its way into Tripoli. Assistance from Qatar and France seems to have been particularly important here, but the Misrata units that were being helped by the British were soon forcing their way into Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte. Even at this point, the British would not give weapons, but it did help the Libyans with radios and other equipment to coordinate airstrikes. France and Qatar did send weapons, including, we've been told, Milan anti-tank missiles like these. As the revolutionaries fought into Sirte, NATO airstrikes were pivotal, and they were coordinated by the British, including men on the ground. Were they involved in the final drama as Muammar al-Gaddafi was taken and then killed by the NTC? That's a subject that everyone remains tight-lipped about. though they do say that within weeks of Gaddafi's death, the Special Forces' presence was being wound down. The architects of the joint UK-French-Qatar operation insist that it gave coherence, organisation and drive to the revolutionary ground forces.
Integrating the Qataris, Emiratis and Jordanians in the operation was also vital. Without them and their defence chiefs' leadership, especially the huge understanding they brought to the campaign, it's unlikely that the NTC's militias could have successfully acted as the land element, without which the right outcome would have been impossible.
The role of Special Forces and MI6 in this process is still not publicly acknowledged, but it was important all the same, and it extended the degree of British involvement in the Libyan revolution to a far greater extent than public statements by the government had suggested.
Well, in a moment, two people who spent some time in the Newsnight studio during the Libyan war and indeed in Libya during and after. The Conservative MP Rory Stewart and the writer and journalist Nabila Ramdani. But first, Mark Urban is here. This is significantly different to what we were told, isn't it?
I think it is, and of course we heard William Hague early on there in the conflict talking about the UK's desire to stay within the terms of that resolution. Now, this is clearly something that exercised people in Whitehall throughout. There were months when they couldn't agree on this. I'm told that lawyers from various departments were very sceptical that it could be done. Eventually, it was done, and finally, these troops who went in, the 24 or so from the SAS from August onwards, were armed, I'm told, whereas the earlier missions, the mentoring or consultants, call them what you will, went in plain clothes, unarmed.
How significant a contribution was it?
Well, it's easy to argue this both ways. I mean, a lot of people would say that even after the fall of Tripoli and even Sirte, that those gangs of men in their pickup trucks with heavy machine guns and all the rest of it were a pretty wild, uncoordinated and indisciplined lot. However, they had achieved their objective, and it was important, I think, for the countries that backed them, that, if you like, they wanted to bank some of the political influence that came from helping them achieve their objective. The Qatar Defence Forces chief has claimed that hundreds of Qatari troops were involved in helping them. People say to me that's an exaggeration. The French want it to be known that they armed the NTC at certain points. And so the UK too, I think, hoped that by being involved in that way, it would buy itself influence in the new Libya.
Do you think they want it to be made public in the way you've just made it public?
I can't say whether that's what the government wants.
OK, Mark, thank you. Well, now, Rory Stewart and Nabila Ramdani, to what extent do you think the revolution is tainted by this sort of discovery?
Well, it's absolutely tainted by this sort of discovery. I think Mark's report is fascinating, but sadly not in the least bit surprising. And what this discussion should be all about is not so much military intervention, but illegal military intervention. And the use of British special forces in Libya shows that the British completely ignored the United Nations Resolution 1973. Well, in many ways, not just by sending special forces on the ground, but the resolution was breached by sending arms to the rebels, by training them, by equipping them with communications, and crucially, the breach of 1973 also resulted in Libyans dying on a daily basis.
Rory Stewart, do you think there was a breach of the UN resolution in this?
No, I don't believe this is a breach of the resolution. The resolution is about occupation forces on the ground, not small covert operations.
That's exactly what it says. It's no force of occupation.
I disagree. What 1973 absolutely do not authorize is elite foreign troops from a Western democracy interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign Arab country. Let's not forget that. And remember that thousands of people died in Libya in spite of Western intervention. So the Libya conflict, the Libya campaign was all about ousting an Arab regime which had fallen out with the West just a few years after dealing with the West.
You don't think he was a tyrant?
Oil.
You don't think he was a tyrant?
Of course he was a tyrant.
Fine.
But it's not up to elite troops from a Western democracy.
But you were in favour of the air campaign, were you?
I was in favour of military intervention when it was abundantly clear that Gaddafi was threatening a bloodbath in Benghazi. What I was disagreeing with is the form, the shape this military intervention took. I'm all for legal intervention when it's fair and transparent, but illegal intervention is something that is morally wrong.
Jeremy, I think the other thing is to put it in proportion. This is a very, very small intervention.
Sure. Doesn't
You're talking
matter
about
how big or small it was. We were misled about it. Public claims were made that there were not British soldiers there, and there were.
The Foreign Secretary is very clear. He said when boots on the ground are talked about, he's talking about large occupation forces. Britain does have intelligence agencies. We have special forces. We did it, as we now know, in Afghanistan. And we did it on a very small scale in Libya, and as Mark has made clear, in a very cautious way. Unarmed initially, very few people, no arming of the rebels. I think that is perfectly within
No
terms.
arming of the rebels?
The British did not arm the rebels.
Well, it doesn't
No,
matter.
that was
They were
left to
part
the
of a
French
NATO
and the
coalition.
Qataris, wasn't it?
But they were part of a NATO coalition, so they are responsible
We're not responsible
for breaches of a fundamental UN resolution.
For Qatar's arming of the rebels.
You are absolutely responsible. And let me put that very clearly. I think UN resolutions are designed for a specific purpose, to intervene when there's a specific threat in real time. And that was the case in Benghazi. What it doesn't authorize is to settle scores with an Arab tyrant which had fallen out with the West.
What is all this talk about settling scores?
Well, let me be clear. Britain was, one day, Britain was serving Gaddafi's enemies on a plate for torture, and the case of Belhaj, who's
We're
now...
going to talk about that in a moment or two, because we're going to be talking to him. But settling of scores, you said?
I'm saying one day Britain was serving Gaddafi's enemies on a plate to him for torture, and the next day it's using its finest elite troops to support them and lead them to victory.
Do you agree that it did at least change the nature of the conflict? Clearly, once embarked upon, it was inconceivable that Britain, France and those who supported them would allow this to have anything other than the outcome they sought.
Yes, I think it's very important to see the context there. I think Britain should be congratulated for being restrained, for not arming the rebels, for not going beyond the terms of the resolution. It's very difficult to do, but I think in the end it was successful. It was successful because we didn't get carried away with. And one of the ways in which I perhaps question Mark's report is there's sometimes suggestions that the military felt their hands were tied too much. In this case, it's correct to tie the military's hands. Vietnam started with a few advisors and ended up with 500,000 troops. What went well here is that we restrained it.
So any kind of commitment would have been fine, providing it had been effective and not too overt or expensive?
No, I think any commitment is fine, provided within the terms of the UN resolution, provided we're not committing atrocities and human rights abuses, provided in the end we end up with a situation with the Libyans' support. And I think we got the balance right. It was a difficult balance, we got it right.
Doesn't transparency matter?
Transparency matters enormously, but I also think a nation should have a secret service, should have special forces, and isn't obliged to reveal on television everything it's doing all the time. And I don't think Britain would benefit from doing that.
Let me ask you this. Do you think the outcome, in the end, justified the means?
Not at all. I think it's far too simplistic and
so
indeed
you'd rather Gaddafi
dangerous.
were there, would you?
No, not at all. As I said, it was very important to intervene militarily to stop the fear of a bloodbath in Benghazi. Once that was achieved, it was morally wrong to take sides in a civil war, to lead a faction of the Libyan population to victory.
All right, well, let's take up that point you raised a moment or two ago, because the inquiry, which was supposed to discover whether people working for the British government might have colluded in torture, has been abandoned, or as the judge who was supposed to be carrying